Welcome to Wild Yoga, Yoga and Thought with Theo Wildcroft. As we entered into conversation with Theo, it soon became apparent that she practices an awful lot of both yoga and thought. This fascinating conversation could have gone on for hours, but it is a pleasure to present here the highlights from that discussion, which encompassed authenticity, vulnerability, post-lineage yoga and much, much more. On your homepage, you describe yourself as a yoga teacher, a lover of vulnerable people and a doctoral researcher. How did these three things come about, and how do they each now fit into a regular week for you? I think I've always been interested in the margins and in people who pick their way towards healing along paths that weren't built with them in mind, and I think that's what unites those passions. I trained as a yoga teacher, like most people, because I was really humbled by what the practice was bringing me, and I wanted to understand it better. I've worked most of my life in some form of informal education, so I'm used to deepening my understanding of a subject beyond my personal experience by sharing it with others. And then really quite early on in my yoga teaching journey, I started to ask myself how positive the benefits of the practice could be if they weren't being adapted to the needs, life experiences and acquired wisdom of the most marginalized people. So rather than seeking to modify a standard practice of yoga for different bodies, I started to ask myself what those bodies needed and already knew how to do. That put me at odds with the universalist and standardized methods of yoga that I had originally trained in, and for that, and other reasons, I found myself in alternative communities of yoga teachers and practitioners, coming together at little events and festivals, on the margins of yoga culture itself. And from there, I started to notice that the major cultural stories about yoga only talked about the superficial, mainstream yoga and the authentic traditions they were based on, and it all seemed very simplistic and wasn't even mentioning this rich diversity of practice that I had discovered. And after ranting about that for a while, a friend said that if I wanted to research it, he'd supervise it, and that's how I fell into doing a PhD with the Open University, which I completed in March this year. So now I'm busy turning that into a book, and planning the next, and also still teaching, although not as much, and mostly the specialist work, in schools and respite centers a few times a week. That and my last 3 regular teaching gigs in small community centers keeps me very grounded, and it is in some ways a contrast with the work I'm also doing now, training yoga teachers, and talking at conferences, and other interesting things that people invite me to. It's a tricky balance, and my diary is extremely finely balanced because I'm doing a lot of work, and it doesn't quite add up to a proper income yet. But I'm testing my research conclusions with new communities and new audiences, and there are a lot of good conversations happening with new friends and allies. Last week I went directly from lecturing to 200 yoga teachers at the first International Yoga Nidra Conference and co-organizing an upcoming panel with colleagues on 3 continents, to leading practice for 5 people in a village hall, and then dealing with a group of teens with moderate learning difficulties who really were not in the mood for concentrating after a long hot day at college. It's a good recipe for not allowing success to enlarge the ego. In terms of your teaching, what word best sums up the key to being a yoga teacher? Safety, freedom, accessibility, authenticity, or something else entirely? All those things are vital, some of them to the practice, some of them to the teaching of the practice. But it's fascinating to me how often we in yoga culture fail to separate the two in terms of what's necessary. The skills of teaching are not the same as the skills of practicing. But there is a word that links them, and it's the foundation of both for me: relationship. How are we coming together, as practitioners in our practice, and as teachers and students? What's needed to get those relationships right? When it comes to yoga practice and yoga therapy for survivors of trauma, how feasible is it to create a framework of training and how to get this right? How did you come to the yoga practice you offer and the way in which you offer it for vulnerable people? Well, firstly, I know there are many that see me as a specialist in trauma, but as a teacher, I'm more of a specialist in accessibility. And interestingly, my research comes to the conclusion that the direction of evolution in yoga teaching can currently be best observed in many ways by watching what's happening to both accessibility and trauma sensitivity as movements emerging into prominence right now. In both cases, the dilemma is how to keep people safe whilst celebrating and encouraging the freedom to diversify the practice in ways that can serve a greater population of people. And really, what it takes is a more democratic approach to practice, and that challenges the traditional teacher-student relationship but also the modern therapy-client relationship in many ways. The fact is that survivors and marginalized people alike are the experts on how their own bodies and minds work. That doesn't mean we have nothing to help. But it's about offering tools more for self-awareness and self-knowledge more than prescribing practices as if they were remedies. It's a change in how we approach teaching, far more than the practices we teach. I'm always asking myself, where is the place where my practice tools, the shared and agreed aim, and the embodied experience of the student meet? That's a very different way of teaching, and it may look nothing like your average yoga class. And I keep reminding people of two things. 1. Survivors have been coming to yoga and quietly finding ways to heal for far longer than trauma-sensitive yoga has been a thing, and 2. That in a given yoga class, you might have trauma survivors, people actively dealing with traumatic levels of stress, people who have been harmed within another yoga environment, and a yoga teacher who worked through their own issues with trauma in the practice. So it's not about starting to heal trauma through yoga as a new adjunct therapy for me. It's about recognizing that survivors are finding both healing and harm in yoga and have been for a long time. In terms of your PhD, what kind of researcher are you and where is this type of research at, both in the UK and across the world? I'm an ethnographer, in the discipline of religious studies. That means I study what people are actually doing, and why, not what used to happen, or what should happen, or what works. This is one of the best academic subjects to do this kind of research in, because RS is naturally very diverse in method and in subject. See, I have colleagues study everything from evolving attitudes to gender in the Church of England, to how far we can use folklore theory to explain online memes, or conversion narratives to understand communities of conspiracy theorists. There's also a tiny and growing field of yoga studies specifically that's becoming more important. We had a major meeting concerning a planned collection of yoga studies essays in London recently, and we all stood on the steps of SOAS University building, and honestly, you could have dropped a big rock on us and wiped out 90% of the researchers into yoga, at least outside of India and outside of the sciences. We're Sanskritists and historians, cultural theorists and observers, looking at everything from previously untranslated ancient texts to the connection between modern yoga in Russia and the occult. So those of us looking at the contemporary picture are an even smaller subset of that. In that context, my thesis is receiving extremely good feedback, and people are saying that it's a whole new paradigm for understanding the evolution of practice, which is nice. Coming back to authenticity, what does authenticity really mean in the world of yoga? That's a great and ever-evolving question. Asking it is a really good way of finding out how a given yoga teacher ticks. Which is why I ask the question a lot and try to listen without my own prejudices getting in the way. At present, the emerging model of authenticity is moving beyond that "my teacher said it, so it must be true" answer that has dominated modern yoga in the last century. It rests, in general, on three sources of authority. The contemporary yoga practitioner-teacher must balance external information from experts coming from the tradition or new research, with internal validation, testing with the inner sense of what works based on practice and experience, with relational confirmation, checking in with your peers, online or more authentic still, with your Sangha. That's a model that moves beyond the lineage as the sole source of authenticity, which is why I'm calling it post-lineage yoga. It doesn't mean throwing out tradition entirely. And it's most interesting in how little attention we often give to the last one. People seem to think that if you move away from lineage at all, then it's anything goes, and the individual is free to do what they like. In reality, yoga practitioners are endlessly discussing together whether something is authentically yoga or not, and while they may disagree on the individual cases of goat yoga or beer yoga, the overall consensus is surprisingly consistent. The peer network holds us all to account without official interference. I find that fascinating. And as a teacher, I do work in a post-lineage way, otherwise I don't think I'd ever have known about it to want to research it. But as a researcher, I'm not advocating for post-lineage yoga. As a response to any perceived issues within the lineages, it's what people with an independent ethical foundation do when they think the direct teachings they received aren't enough. It's not a model for structural change on its own, or a banner to march under. I think it is a hashtag already though. From your own experience and observation, how is the perception of yoga changing in the modern world right now? What are the main trends in the conversation around yoga? What's tiring is the often huge gap between public perceptions of yoga and the reality of the practice. It can mean that teachers are always resisting the pull by financial forces to conform to a superficial, media-created version of the practice, when they themselves have a much deeper relationship to the teachings. If the people who think they'll like yoga are coming with a very different idea of it than what you're offering, that can be very depressing. And I think because of this, the longer you teach, sometimes, the less you're able to provide the kinds of classes that draw lots of people, but the more loyal the students you do have. And that's fine, it is what it is. What's more worrying to me is that there are lots of marginalized people who could really benefit from the practice who aren't, because it doesn't look like yoga is for them. So the answer to both is diversifying the practice, and how we represent it, and the ways in which we offer it, and making sure that when we're working with those underserved populations, we're doing so respectfully and appropriately. Pivoting between those two questions though, that's very different to what the trends are in conversations between yoga teachers and serious practitioners. And that has a lot to do with big, often scary questions about accountability, and reconciling with historical abuse in many lineages, and how we make our spaces safer, and whether there will be a place for independent, grassroots yoga teaching when our practices are being extracted and standardized and sold back to us on a million different apps and YouTube channels. Because it won't matter if we know that's only a narrow part of what the practice has to offer, if mainstream culture thinks that's all there is. In the meantime, the interest in yoga as an adjunct therapy might seem positive, but is likely to involve other tangled issues such as standardization and replicability and government oversight, and how are we going to resolve that? And all that great new research into yoga brings new understandings of the history and foundations and socio-political context of the practice all the time. So if you're still reeling from the idea that most modern practices were created or recreated in the 1930s, and far from being the father of yoga, Patanjali's sutras might have been an obscure and little-known text before that, and you don't want to have to think about the UAL abuse of practitioners disguised as spiritual assistants by some of the founders of modern yoga, that's getting harder. Above all, if you want your practice to be an oasis from mundane concerns, that's going to get more and more difficult. These are in many ways the growing pains of transnational yoga. You're fascinated about the significance of symbols and rituals in shaping our world and our worldview. What role do symbols and rituals play in a yoga practice, in your yoga practice? I think it's about the ritualization of everyday life, the magical in the mundane if you like. Coming to a mat almost every day, moving through a repertoire of practices that are like embodied memories of core transformational experiences, choosing to check in, to affirm that sacred relationship with the more than human world that breathes and moves to a different rhythm to the cultural world we spend so much time in. It's about weaving into that everything we are, including the domestic disturbances, and the demands of our loved ones, and the crappy days we've had. It's about the things that hold me safe and remind me who I am, from my precious 2 meters diameter round yoga mat that I redecorate every year, to the battered low Chinese table found in a second-hand shop that I use for an altar. It's all the tiny murtis I've collected over the years. It's also about the other strands of my religious life, seeing in the dawn at every solstice for well over a decade, with new gods and old, the teachers who taught me to journey, the friends who gifted me a replica sword to represent standing up for the untold stories of the marginalized. It's about Siva and Bhakti with the core friends at the heart of my ever-widening Sangha. Robert Orsi talks of the work of religious studies scholars almost as an act of justice. That if we do not tell the stories of the marginalized but the everyday signs and symbols that they pick up to make sense of their world and their suffering and their hope, then all we have left are the legends of the powerful. So even in teaching, I use metaphors and symbols of the small and the miraculously ordinary, the dandelions and the hedgehogs and the spider's webs. You can learn a lot about what someone values from listening to the symbols they identify with. As a final question, what is it that you currently love most about yoga and where is it that you are heading? I think transnational yoga culture and I are both balancing the very real need to listen to where the practice isn't serving us, with the very real stories of hope from when it does. I'm looking forward to getting my first book finished, and to hanging out with the accessible yoga and yoga nidra network sanghas in the months ahead.